What if the man who dreamed of conquering the entire world started his empire with a single diamond glinting beneath African soil? In 1871, under the relentless African sun, a pale young man with an English accent stood on a barren ridge overlooking the rolling plains of southern Africa. Dust clung to his boots, sweat burned his eyes, but what he saw shimmering in the riverbed below would change the fate of a continent. His name was Cecil Rhodes, and from that moment, Africa would never be the same. He was only 18 when he arrived, fragile, asthmatic, and reeking of ambition. Sent by his family to South Africa to improve his health, he carried little more than a suitcase, a Bible, and an iron determination to rise above his station. But what he found there wasn't just fresh air. It was the glittering heart of the world's next obsession, diamonds. The Kimberley fields had erupted like a fever dream. Men from every corner of the earth clawed at the red dirt, hoping to strike fortune. It was chaos, a wild, lawless sprawl of tents and greed. The sun beat down on half-starved miners who fought, gambled, and killed for stones no larger than a fingernail. And in the midst of it all, Rhodes watched. Quiet, patient, calculating. He saw what others didn't. Not just the diamonds, but the power they represented. The Englishman's mind, sharpened by privilege and shaped by empire, began to spin a vision, one that stretched far beyond the dusty mines. To Rhodes, Africa wasn't a land to explore. It was a map to redraw. Every empire begins with a hunger. For some, it's gold or land. For Rhodes, it was destiny. He once wrote, "To be born an Englishman is to win first prize in the lottery of life." He believed that the British were chosen not just to rule their island, but to rule the world. And Africa, vast and rich, was his chosen canvas. But before he could paint his empire across the continent, he needed control. In the diamond fields, control was chaos. Fortunes rose and vanished in a day. Companies battled for dominance, and men lost their lives in the dust. Rhodes understood something most didn't. Power doesn't belong to the strongest, or even the smartest. It belongs to the one who can wait the longest. While others chased quick profit, Rhodes schemed in silence. He borrowed money, bought out rivals, and maneuvered his way into partnerships. By his late 20s, he controlled nearly all diamond production in South Africa through his company De Beers, a name that would, for more than a century, define the price of love and the greed of empire. But diamonds were only the beginning. Beyond the glittering stones lay a continent still unclaimed, a land teeming with tribes, kingdoms, and resources the world had yet to understand. And Rhodes wanted it all. His eyes turned north, toward a vast territory known as Zambezia, the land between the Limpopo and Zambezi rivers. In his mind, it was the future jewel of the British crown. He had already mastered the art of manipulation. Now, he would learn to use it on an imperial scale. Rhodes understood that to conquer Africa, he didn't need armies. He needed signatures. And he would get them one by one, through charm, deceit, and promises of friendship. He sent envoys to negotiate with African chiefs, presenting them with treaties they couldn't read, papers that, once signed, handed over their lands, their minerals, and their futures. In 1889, his efforts paid off. Queen Victoria granted him the rights to Zambezia through what became known as the Royal Charter, the document that gave birth to the British South Africa Company. It was, in effect, a license to steal on behalf of the crown. The empire now had a man who could do what governments could not: claim, rule, and exploit vast regions under the guise of civilization. And Rhodes, now in his 30s, stood at the helm, draped in ambition, believing he was chosen by God and history alike. But behind that calm, aristocratic voice lay something darker. To Rhodes, Africans were obstacles, shadows in the path of progress. He spoke of bringing light to a dark continent, but his light burned villages, displaced families, and erased cultures. As his power grew, so did his vision. He dreamed of building a railway stretching from Cape Town to Cairo, a red line cutting through jungles, deserts, and kingdoms, a symbol of British supremacy running across the spine of Africa. It wasn't just infrastructure, it was domination turned into geography. And as he built his empire, Rhodes became both admired and feared. British newspapers celebrated him as a hero, the man civilizing Africa. But to those who lived under his rule, he was something else entirely, a force that crushed resistance beneath the boots of mercenaries and the ink of treaties. In the towns of southern Africa, people whispered about him, about the man who could bend governments to his will, who dined with monarchs but schemed like a gambler. His fortune was immense, his influence immeasurable. Yet those who looked closer saw a restless unease behind his polished smile. He believed time itself was against him. His lungs were failing, his health crumbling. But the more his body weakened, the stronger his obsession grew. In his private writings, he confessed dreams of conquering the stars, of seeing the British flag flying not only over Africa, but across the entire world. "Why should we not form a secret society?" he wrote, "with but one object, the furtherance of the British Empire." It wasn't enough to rule a company. He wanted to rule history. The lands he claimed would later bear his name, Rhodesia, carved from the soil of modern-day Zimbabwe and Zambia. To the empire, it was triumph. To the people, it was tragedy. Their fields became mines, their rivers boundaries, their traditions relics of a world erased by maps drawn in London. Yet, for all his power, Rhodes could not escape the judgment of time. Even his allies began to whisper that he had gone too far, that the empire he built on deceit and diamonds was destined to crack. In the final years of his life, he returned often to the cliffs of the Cape, staring out at the endless sea, haunted by what he had done and what he still longed to do. The man who once sought to paint the world in red now faced a horizon he could no longer conquer. And yet, even as his breath grew shallow, his empire continued to grow, feeding on the momentum he had unleashed. British soldiers, traders, and settlers pushed deeper into the continent, their boots echoing his ambitions. The scars of his dream, the wars, the borders, the inequality, would outlive him by centuries. When Cecil Rhodes died in 1902, he was only 48. His funeral stretched across continents, a spectacle of empire. His body was carried to the Matapos Hills in what is now Zimbabwe, buried among the rocks he once claimed as his own. The local people called that place the view of the world. For them, it was sacred. For Rhodes, it was the final symbol of possession. But even in death, the question lingers. Was Rhodes a visionary or a villain? A builder of nations or a destroyer of them? His empire, born from ambition and arrogance, became both the pride and the shame of Britain's history. And though a century has passed, the consequences of his dreams still pulse through Africa's veins. The borders he drew remain, the wounds he caused still bleed. Yet, somewhere beneath those same African skies, the ground still glitters, not with diamonds, but with the remnants of a past that refuses to be buried. Because every empire leaves behind a ghost, and Cecil Rhodes' ghost still walks the plains of Africa, whispering of power, greed, and the dangerous illusion of destiny. But what if that ghost was never his alone? What if the empire he built wasn't the end of a story, but the beginning of something far more haunting? That answer lies beyond the graves, beyond the gold, in the next chapter of how Africa fought back against the dream of empire. And the man who thought he could own it forever! The wind swept across the African plains like an ancient breath, slow, unending, and filled with memory. The empire Cecil Rhodes had dreamed into existence was still spreading its roots, reaching north like veins of iron and greed. But what Rhodes never truly saw, or refused to, was that the land he claimed was never his to begin with. The African kingdoms, scarred yet unbroken, were beginning to awaken. Beneath the banners of the British South Africa Company, men in red coats marched, maps in hand, guns gleaming under the sun. Yet, behind every hill, there were eyes watching, eyes that remembered the treaties, the lies, and the silence that followed. It began in Matabiland, a region ruled by a proud warrior king named Loban. He was cautious, deliberate, a man who understood power not as possession but as trust. When Rhodes' agents first arrived at his kraal, they came dressed in European suits, bearing gifts, and speaking of friendship, they offered rifles, gold, and promises of peace. all wrapped in the ink of a single document. The Rudd Concession. Lobengula, unaware of the deception, placed his mark upon it, believing he had granted limited mining rights. In truth, he had just surrendered the sovereignty of his kingdom. When he discovered the betrayal, it was too late. British settlers poured in by the hundreds, claiming land, driving cattle, and planting flags. Rhodes called it progress. Lobengula called it invasion. The tension snapped in 1893. Smoke rose over Matabeleland as British forces advanced. Armed with the latest Maxim guns, the first machine guns ever used in Africa. The Matabele warriors, fierce and unyielding, charged with spears and courage against a weapon they had never seen before. The air was torn apart by mechanical thunder. Within minutes, thousands lay dead. For the Empire, it was victory. For Africa, it was the beginning of an unending sorrow. Rhodes stood miles away, his boots planted in the dust, watching the sun disappear behind the carnage. He didn't flinch. In his mind, the blood on the ground was the ink of empire, the price of civilization. And yet, there was something strange in his gaze that evening. A flicker, perhaps, of unease. Or maybe he was simply counting the cost of conquest. But power, once tasted, never releases its hold. With Matabeleland subdued, Rhodes pressed further north. He dreamed of his railway from Cape Town to Cairo, the artery of empire. Surveyors moved ahead, slicing the wilderness with chains and compasses. Every mile claim felt like a triumph, yet every step forward deepened the resentment buried beneath the soil. The land remembered. In villages across the territories now bearing his name, southern and northern Rhodesia, whispers began to spread. The ancestors were angry. The spirits of the slain cried out in the night winds. The British called it superstition. But the people called it truth! And beneath those whispers, something else began to stir resistance. The empire thought it had silenced Africa, but beneath the surface, a pulse remained. Quiet, steady, waiting. Years passed. Towns rose where forests once stood. Mines swallowed mounds. And in every corner of Rhodes' territories, the British flag fluttered, stitched in arrogance and dust. To outsiders, it looked like progress, railroads, schools, missions. But to those who lived through it, it was a tightening chain disguised as salvation. Cecil Rhodes, meanwhile, was consumed by his own mythology. He began to speak of himself as a prophet of destiny. He saw Africa not as a continent of nations, but as a stage for the expansion of British virtue. He funded scholarships, created secret societies, and dreamed of molding generations of men to carry forward his vision. Men who would think like him, rule like him, believe like him. He called it a gift to civilization. History would call it an infection of arrogance. Yet, even as his empire grew, so too did the cracks beneath its surface. The African people were no longer silent. Across the newly carved territories, small fires of defiance began to burn, sometimes in the form of rebellion, sometimes in the form of song, sometimes simply in the refusal to forget. One evening in 1896, as the rains gathered over Matabeleland once again, a vision came to a spiritual leader known as Mimo. He spoke of ancestral vengeance, that the land itself would rise against the invaders. Soon after, the Matabele warriors, their hearts heavy with grief and anger, took up arms once more. It became known as the Second Matabele War, but to the locals, it was the War of the Ancestors. They moved under moonlight, striking outposts and railways, reclaiming what had been taken. Rhodes, desperate to keep control, rode into the heart of the rebellion himself. For the first time, the empire builder faced those he had wronged not as a conqueror, but as a man. He met the Matabele leaders in a cave near the Matapos Hills, the same hills where he would one day be buried. There, under the flicker of torchlight, surrounded by warriors whose families had died at his command, Rhodes removed his hat and spoke softly. He did not apologize, but he pleaded for peace. The warriors listened in silence. The fire crackled between them like the voice of judgment. That night, the rebellion slowed. Not because Rhodes convinced them, but because the spirits were tired of blood. When he rode back to Cape Town, Rhodes was hailed as a peacemaker. But inside, something in him had changed. He had seen the limits of his empire, not in power, but in the human cost it demanded. For the first time, he looked at Africa and saw not a possession, but a mirror. And what he saw reflected was monstrous. He began to isolate himself. His health worsened, his breathing labored. In his journals, his words grew erratic, feverish. He spoke of unfulfilled destinies, of unseen empires, of being betrayed by time itself. One evening, standing on the cliffs of the Cape, the ocean roaring below, he whispered to a companion, "So much to do, and so little done." The empire he built continued to move without him, a machine powered by the very greed and ambition he had set in motion. The British South Africa Company became a state unto itself, ruling millions, taxing, trading, and expanding. Towns named after him rose like monuments to conquest. Rhodesville, Rhodes Park, Rhodes Avenue. But in the heart of Africa, the land remained restless. The people had learned something Rhodes never could, that empires are not eternal. They are storms, and all storms pass. As the century turned and Rhodes' health crumbled, Africa began to whisper a new story, one of awakening. Missionaries had brought education, unintentionally planting seeds of rebellion in the minds of the young. Those who once labored in mines began to question the hands that owned them. Those who learned the colonizers' language began to turn it into a weapon of truth. History was beginning to turn. In his final months, Rhodes moved between his estates like a ghost Garuda shooter. In Cape Town, the Matapos Hills in the north, always chasing a horizon he could no longer see. He was surrounded by luxury, yet haunted by emptiness. He would stare at maps for hours, tracing the red lines that represented the empire he had dreamed of connecting. Cape to Cairo! A single road of British power. But even then, he knew it would never be completed. As his lungs failed, his thoughts turned once more to Africa itself, not the empire, but the earth. He ordered that he be buried in the Matapos Hills, among the granite domes he once claimed as his own. He wanted to rest at what he called the world's view. The irony was lost on him, for the world he helped build would soon begin to unravel. On a quiet night in March 1902, Cecil Rhodes took his last breath. The news spread through the colonies like a tremor. Some wept. Others whispered prayers of gratitude that the tyrant was gone. His funeral procession stretched 4 miles, an imperial theater of flags, horses, and solemn faces. And when they lowered his body into the rock, the African wind carried away the last of his empire's illusions. But death did not silence him. His dream lived on in the systems he created, the boundaries he drew, the ideologies he bred. The Rhodes Scholarship he founded would go on to educate world leaders, some who would challenge empire, and others who would quietly preserve it. And across the continent he once sought to own, the struggle for freedom began to rise like dawn after a long, brutal night. In the years that followed, Africa would burn again and again. Not under foreign guns this time, but under the fires of rebellion and independence. Rhodes' name would become both legacy and curse, etched into schools. Rhodes, and the memories of generations torn between admiration and fury. But somewhere, deep in the Matapos Hills, legend says the earth still stirs around his grave. That on nights when the wind moves just right, the plains whisper his name. Not in reverence, but in warning, because history has a way of speaking back. And for all his power, Rhodes could never silence the one truth that outlives every empire. No man, no nation, no vision can own the soul of a land forever. Yet what would happen decades later, when that soul finally rose to reclaim itself, when the ghosts of empire met the voices of revolution, would change Africa once more and expose the final hidden price of Rhodes' dream. The decades after Rhodes' death did not bring peace, only a silence that felt heavier than war. His empire had not vanished. It had merely changed its shape. The British South Africa Company dissolved, but the system it birthed remained a machine of ownership and hierarchy that hummed beneath the surface of daily life. Across the continent, fields once ruled by kings were now measured in acres and deeds, the rhythm of the drums replaced by the ticking of ledgers. But under the weight of that silence, something was shifting. The land remembered. The people remembered. In the dusts of southern Rhodesia, a young boy named Joshua grew up watching white settlers ride horses past his village. He watched his father forced to work land that had once belonged to their ancestors. He watched his mother bow her head when government men arrived. To him, the name Rhodes was not a man. It was a shadow, a word that carried both power and pain. Years later, that boy would become Joshua Nikamo, one of the men who would ignite the fire of independence. But before that fire, there was the slow kindling of realization. Throughout the early 20th century, the descendants of empire lived in comfort, while the descendants of the conquered lived in confinement. The railways that Rhodes had dreamed of stretched farther, but they carried more than goods. They carried division. Africans were moved into segregated lands called reserves, stripped of rights, stripped of memory. The British called it administration. The people called it suffocation. Yet even as the chains of empire tightened, the world around them began to change. The First World War tore Europe apart, and for the first time, Africans fought side by side with their colonizers, believing that loyalty would earn them freedom. They fought in deserts and trenches, carried rifles and hope, but when the war ended, that hope turned to bitterness. Freedom was promised and denied, and so the silence broke. In the cities of Salisbury and Bulawayo, whispers turned into meetings, and meetings into movements. Educated Africans, the very generation Rhodes scholarships had unknowingly inspired, began to question everything. They spoke of equality, of ownership, of a future without masters. The ghost of Rhodes still lingered in the corridors of power, but the voices rising against him were no longer afraid of ghosts. By the 1950s, the world was trembling under the weight of revolution. India had risen. Ghana had declared independence. And in the southern heart of Africa, the embers of rebellion began to glow again. The white minority governments, descendants of Rhodes settlers, watched in fear. They tightened laws, built prisons, censored newspapers. But it was too late. The land had waited long enough. Joshua Nikamo, now a leader, walked the same plains Rhodes once claimed, his footsteps heavy with purpose. He spoke to crowds under the open sky, his voice echoing through valleys that had witnessed both conquest and resistance. This land, he said, was never given to us. It was taken. And what is taken can be taken back. His words spread like fire through the villages. Farmers hid rebels in their barns. Young men vanished into the bush, returning with weapons and resolve. The struggle had begun, not against one man, but against the lingering empire he left behind. The Rhodesian government struck back hard. Helicopters thundered across the savannas, soldiers combed the forests, and entire communities were burned in the name of order. But every act of violence only deepened the resolve of those who fought. Meanwhile, in London, politicians debated the future of a colony that had become a moral burden. The British Empire was crumbling. India gone. Kenya burning. Nigeria restless. But Rhodesia was different. It wasn't just another colony. It was his legacy, his experiment in empire made permanent. And so, when the settlers declared unilateral independence in 1965, cutting ties with Britain to preserve white rule, it felt like the ghost of Cecil Rhodes himself had risen to defend his dream. The world watched in disbelief. A colony had declared itself a nation, Rhodesia, still bearing the name of the man who believed Africa existed to be ruled. For nearly 2 decades, the war raged. Villages became battlefields, children became soldiers, and hope became a weapon. The lines between liberation and vengeance blurred. In the bush, under the cover of night, a young fighter once asked his commander, "Do you think Rhodes knew this would happen?" The commander paused, the campfire flickering in his eyes. "He knew," he said, "but he never believed we'd live long enough to fight back." By the late 1970s, the world's patience was gone. Sanctions, diplomacy, exhaustion, everything converged toward a breaking point. And in 1980, the impossible happened. The flag of Rhodesia was lowered for the last time, and in its place rose a new one, green, yellow, red, and black. The nation was renamed Zimbabwe. The people celebrated, tears and laughter spilling into the same soil that had soaked their ancestors' blood. It felt as if history had finally exhaled. The ghost of Rhodes was buried again, or so they thought. But freedom, like empire, carries its own illusions. The new leaders promised unity and justice, yet within years, power began to corrode those promises. The same systems Rhodes had built, ownership, division, control, still pulsed beneath the surface. Land reforms turned violent, political rivalries deepened, and corruption replaced colonialism as the new master. Rhodes' ghost didn't need to haunt Africa. His ideas were already alive, reborn in the hands of those who once sought to destroy them. One historian later wrote, "The tragedy of Rhodesia is not that Rhodes conquered Africa, but that Africa inherited his methods." It was a painful truth. The cycle of power repeating itself under different flags. And yet, not everything was lost. In the universities, a new generation began to study Rhodes not as a hero, but as a warning. His statue at the University of Cape Town became a symbol of protest. Students covered it in red paint, chanting, "Rhodes must fall." The call spread like wildfire across campuses, across borders, across centuries of silence. It was not just about a man, but about everything he represented. The arrogance, the erasure, the empire that still lived in the bones of modern Africa. But as his statues fell, something unexpected happened. Scholars, artists, and historians began to dig deeper, not to glorify him, but to understand him. They found contradictions. A man who dreamed of education yet built on oppression, who spoke of civilization yet thrived on exploitation. One document, discovered in a private archive in Oxford, revealed something extraordinary, a letter Rhodes wrote just months before his death. In it, he confessed, "I have built my empire upon the sands of ambition, and though I have conquered, I remain unconquered by peace." It was the closest thing to regret he had ever written. The revelation sent shockwaves through academic circles. For the first time, people began to wonder, did Rhodes, in the final moments of his life, understand what he had done? Did he see that his dream of British supremacy would one day crumble under the weight of its own contradictions? Some believed he did. Others said it didn't matter. What mattered was what came next, how the world would choose to remember him. In the modern world, the battle over his memory became as fierce as the wars he once caused. To some, he remained the architect of empire, the man who brought roads, schools, and commerce. To others, he was a symbol of everything wrong with colonization, greed dressed as progress, racism cloaked in destiny. The truth, as it always is, lay somewhere in between, shifting like dust in the African wind. Today, the Matapos Hills still hold his grave. The same granite dome. The same endless horizon. Tourists visit, leaving flowers, coins, sometimes curses. Locals still call the place Malandidzimu, the home of spirits. And when the storms roll in from the east, lightning cracks across the stone, as if the sky itself refuses to let him rest. But there's something else, too. A story rarely told. One night, years ago, during a particularly violent storm, the guards near his grave claimed they heard voices, not human voices, but whispers carried by the wind. One of them swore he heard a question in English. "Have I been forgiven yet?" He left his post that night and never returned. Of course, it could have been nothing more than wind and imagination. But perhaps not. Perhaps some ghosts are doomed not because of what they did, but because of what they began. Cecil Rhodes dreamed of conquering Africa. In the end, Africa conquered him, not through battle, but through time. His empire crumbled, his statues fell, his name became both curse and study. Yet the shadow of what he built, the hunger for control, the illusion of destiny, still lingers in the hearts of nations. And maybe that is the true story of empire. Not its rise, nor its fall, but its quiet persistence in the minds of those who inherit its ruins. Because even now, as Africa moves forward, Questions remain, whispered between progress and memory. Was Rhodes merely a man of his era, or the blueprint for every empire that followed? And if history is doomed to repeat the dreams of men like him, then perhaps the real question isn't what Rhodes did to Africa, but what we've allowed his shadow to do to us. And in that silence, as the last light fades over the Matapos hills, a single truth hangs in the air, one that could change how history itself is remembered. The rain had returned that night, soft at first, a whisper against the glass, then steady, rhythmic, almost purposeful, as if nature itself sought to drown out the echoes of everything that had been said. Inside the dimly lit study, the air was dense with the scent of old paper and something more intangible, the residue of secrets too long contained. The map that had once seemed like a curiosity now lay unfurled across the table, its ink bleeding slightly under a stray drop of water that had found its way through a cracked window pane. Shadows danced across its surface like restless ghosts, tracing the faded lines of an empire that had consumed everything in its path, leaving behind a legacy built on quiet suffering. Eleanor stood before it, her reflection flickering faintly in the glass behind her, a mirror of doubt and exhaustion. Her hands trembled slightly as she ran her fingertips over the markings. Every symbol now felt alive, charged with meaning she hadn't yet grasped. In the distance, the old clock struck midnight. The sound carried through the house, solemn and final, like a warning that time was running out, not just in hours, but in chances. A faint creak came from the corridor. She turned, her pulse quickening. For a moment, there was nothing, just the hum of the storm. Then, the door eased open. It was Thomas, his coat soaked through, his face pale with something between fear and conviction. "You shouldn't be here," Eleanor whispered, though part of her had been waiting for him. "I had to see it for myself," he said quietly, stepping into the light. His eyes moved to the map. "You were right. It wasn't just trade routes or colonial records. It's something older, something that was never meant to be rediscovered." Eleanor's voice was low, steady, despite the tremor in her chest. "You found the second ledger?" He nodded, pulling a weathered book from his coat pocket. Its leather cover was warped from rain, but the seal on it, the same insignia that appeared on the Queen's 1889 charter, was unmistakable. He placed it beside the map. "Rhodes wasn't building an empire," Thomas said. "He was building a system, one that used exploration as camouflage. Every expedition, every grant from the crown was tied to something buried, something he was trying to control." Eleanor's breath caught. "Control!" Thomas met her gaze. Energy. Power in its most literal form. Zambezia wasn't just about gold or diamonds. It was about something elemental. The diaries called it the pulse of the earth. They said it could grant dominion over life itself. A silence followed, heavy and electric. The fire flickered, as if reacting to the very word. Eleanor looked away, her voice breaking slightly. "That can't be true." "That kind of myth is exactly what they wanted you to believe," Thomas interrupted. "That it was a myth. That it ended with him." "But it didn't." It didn't. Outside, lightning illuminated the sky, casting the shadows across the walls, two figures entangled in history's unfinished business. Eleanor felt her heartbeat in her throat. She moved closer to the map, noticing for the first time that one of the ink lines led not to Africa, but away from it, across the ocean, to a series of coordinates scrawled in red. "This point," she whispered, tracing the mark. "It's not on any of the records I've seen." Thomas exhaled. "That's because it's not supposed to be." The location was erased from every official document after 1892, but Rhodes's private notes mentioned a final vault, a place where he sealed what he couldn't control. Her eyes met his, realization dawning like a sunrise, laced with dread. "You think it's still there?" "I know it is." The next day blurred into a series of frantic motions, packing, decoding, preparing. The map, now dried and carefully folded, was tucked into Eleanor's satchel, while the ledger remained clutched in Thomas's hands like a lifeline. Their journey led them beyond the city, through winding dirt roads, across landscapes that seemed untouched by time. The further they went, the more the world around them changed. Trees grew denser, the air thicker, as if the earth itself recognized what they sought and tried to slow their passage. By the third night, They reached the plateau, a desolate stretch of land overlooking what once had been a mining site. The ground was littered with fragments of rusted machinery and the skeletal remains of outposts long abandoned. The wind here had a voice low and mournful, carrying whispers that seemed almost human. Eleanor knelt beside one of the stone markers, brushing away the dust to reveal a series of carved initials. "These were surveyor marks," she murmured. "Late 19th century. Her eyes lifted to Thomas. "We're close!" He looked toward the horizon, where a faint glow pulsed beneath the soil, like a heartbeat buried deep underground. "It's responding to something," he said. "Maybe the storm?" They descended into the ravine as thunder rolled across the sky. Every step felt heavier, as if gravity itself was thickening around them. The air vibrated faintly, humming through their bones. When they reached the base, they found it a structure half swallowed by the earth, its stone doors carved with the same sigil that had haunted every page of Rhodes's ledger. Eleanor's voice trembled. "We shouldn't open it." Thomas hesitated. "You think leaving it buried will stop what's already started?" He pressed his hand against the surface. The symbol flared faintly under his touch, reacting like a living thing. The doors shuddered, then groaned as they began to part, exhaling a breath of cold air that smelled of centuries gone. Inside, darkness stretched endlessly. They entered slowly, their lanterns cutting through the thick air. The chamber walls were lined with murals, depictions of empires rising and falling, of men kneeling before radiant stones that pulsed with inner light. At the center stood a pedestal, and upon it a crystalline object, fractured yet glowing softly, like a shard of frozen lightning. Eleanor stepped forward, mesmerized. "This is it. The pulse!" Thomas's expression was unreadable. "Or what's left of it." He approached carefully, eyes narrowing as the light within the crystal shifted, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. "It's reacting to us." Then the sound came, a faint Ashu-like footsteps where none should be. They turned sharply, the lantern beam slicing across the darkness. Nothing. Just the steady hum of the stone. Eleanor's whisper was barely audible. "Did you hear?" Before she could finish, the ground trembled. Dust rained from the ceiling, and the murals seemed to ripple as if the walls themselves were breathing. The crystal brightened, its pulse growing faster, more frantic. Thomas reached out instinctively, and the moment his fingers brushed it, a blinding flash filled the room. Images flooded their minds, visions not of the past, but of something deeper, older. They saw the expansion of the British Empire not as conquest, but as ritual lines of power drawn across continents to feed a single source. The colonies, the railways, the mines, all part of a network designed to channel energy back to the heart of the empire. The realization struck like a physical blow. Rhodes had not sought wealth. He had sought transcendence. The light faded. Thomas staggered, gasping, clutching his head. He used it. He choked out. He used it to rewrite history. Eleanor could barely speak. "Then, what happens if it wakes again?" Thunder cracked overhead, closer now, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The crystal's glow flickered erratically, casting wild shadows across the chamber. They both knew something had been triggered. "We need to leave," she said urgently. "Now." But as they turned toward the entrance, they saw it. The figure standing in the doorway, a man draped in dark attire, face obscured by the shadow of his hat. He held no lantern, yet his eyes reflected the same eerie light that pulsed from the crystal. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "You shouldn't have come here!" Eleanor's breath caught. "Who are you?" The man stepped forward, and for an instant, the lightning outside illuminated his features, familiar, impossibly so. It was the face from Rhodes, is finado por derecho, unchanged by time. Thomas froze. "That's not possible." The figure smiled faintly, though his expression carried a weariness that transcended life itself. "History is written by those who refuse to die," he said. And then, with a slow movement, he reached for the crystal, the pulse within it now wild and blinding as the walls began to crack. The earth itself trembling with ancient fury. Eleanor screamed his name, but her voice was lost in the roar that followed a sound like the tearing of the world itself. And in that moment, as the storm outside broke in full force, everything they thought they knew began to unravel. The past was no longer behind them. It was awake. The sound that followed was not like thunder. It was deeper, older. It felt as if the earth itself had drawn breath for centuries and was now exhaling all at once. Dust and light collided in the vault as the stone walls split open, revealing veins of something alive beneath the rock, molten streaks of light pulsing like arteries through the earth. Eleanor was thrown back by the force of it, crashing against the cold stone, her lantern shattering beside her. Thomas fell to his knees, eyes fixed on the man, or the thing, that wore Rhodes's face. The figure stood unmoved in the chaos, his silhouette framed by a storm of light. The air shimmered around him, bending as if reality itself struggled to contain his presence. His voice, when it came, carried not through sound but through vibration, echoing in their bones. "You opened the door I sealed," he said, "and now it remembers." Eleanor crawled toward Thomas, her hands trembling, her heart pounding in her ears. "What is he?" she gasped. Thomas didn't answer. He couldn't. He stared as fragments of memory that weren't flickered behind his eyes, visions of Rhodes standing in this same chamber, centuries ago, performing a ritual beneath the same storm. Not a man seeking power, but trying desperately to bind something that could not be destroyed. And somehow, through time, through the land itself, the remnants of that binding had lingered, feeding on empires, on greed, on the endless hunger of men. The crystal at the center pulsed violently, like a dying heart. Rhodes, or whatever wore his image, turned to it, his expression a mixture of awe and sorrow. "It was never meant for human hands," he said quietly. "Yet, every generation tries again." Lightning tore through the sky above, illuminating the open fissures that now spread across the chamber floor. From them, light surged upward, spectral and violent, forming ghostly outlines of faces, of cities, of history itself, unraveling. Eleanor felt the air thin. Her visions, swimming as memories not her own, flashed before her ships setting sail, soldiers marching under burning suns. Contracts signed in candlelight, all of it connected to this one pulse beneath their feet. Thomas struggled to his feet, shouting over the storm. If it's alive, then it can be stopped. Rhodes's eyes shifted toward him, their glow dimming with something that resembled pity. "Stopped," he murmured. "You can't stop what you are part of." He stepped forward, the floor trembling with each movement. Every empire, every invention, every step toward progress, all drawn from this same well. The pulse isn't just power. It's history. It's the will that drives mankind forward, even when it destroys itself. Eleanor's voice broke through the noise. "Then why seal it away?" "Because I saw what happens when it wakes fully." A silence fell, sudden and sharp, as if the world itself was listening. The glow dimmed just for a moment, and Rhodes looked older. Not immortal, not untouchable, but burdened. "It doesn't just feed on the land," he said. "It feeds on belief, on ambition. The more the world wants, the stronger it grows. I tried to bury it, to let time forget. But time remembers everything." The chamber groaned again, a deep, grinding sound that made the floor shudder. The crystal cracked, light spilling out like blood from a wound. Thomas stumbled forward. "If it feeds on belief," he shouted, "then maybe we can starve it." Eleanor's eyes met his, realization dawning in both of them at once. The pulse wasn't a weapon. It was a mirror, reflecting the human desire to dominate, to possess. If they could reject it, refuse it, maybe it would fade. She turned to Rhodes. "What happens if we let it die?" He hesitated, his voice a whisper now. "Then everything built upon it will fall." The implications sank like a blade. The railroads, the cities, the empire itself, all born from this hidden current. To destroy it was to erase the foundation of the modern world. Thomas's voice was low, steady. "Maybe that's what needs to happen." The air around them tightened, charged with decision. The pulse flared, reacting as if it could hear them. Rhodes's form wavered, his outline flickering between man and light. "You don't understand," he said. "If you break the chain, you break yourselves." Eleanor took a step toward the crystal, her hand reaching out. The glow illuminated her face. Not with power, but with peace. Then maybe it's time we learned who we are without it. Rhodes lunged, his voice cracking through the storm. No! But she had already touched it. The world erupted. For a moment, there was no sound, no form, no time, just light. Endless, blinding light that tore through the chamber and reached upward, splitting the storm open like a wound in the sky. The ground quaked so violently it felt as if the planet itself might split. Every image, every ghost of empire, every echo of conquest was pulled into the light and devoured. Eleanor's body was weightless, her mind a flood of memories, her own and those not her own, until they blurred into one single truth. History was alive, and it had always been watching. Then, suddenly, silence. When the light receded, she lay on the cold ground, gasping for air. The chamber was unrecognizable, the murals gone, the walls blackened, the crystal shattered into 1,000 dull shards. The pulse was gone. Thomas Canerito beside the hot dirt streaking his face, eyes wide with disbelief. "You did it," he whispered. Eleanor shook her head weakly. "No, we did." She looked around. "Where's he?" The space where Rhodes had stood was empty. Only a faint imprint of light lingered, drifting upward like smoke. And yet, as it faded, a whisper seemed to echo through the ruins. Not words, but the faint impression of regret. Outside, the storm was breaking. Through a fissure in the ceiling, dawn's first light crept in, painting the ruins gold. The air felt lighter, cleaner. The hum that had haunted the land for centuries was gone. They climbed out in silence. The plateau looked different now, the soil no longer pulsing, the horizon strangely calm. Birds, absent for hours, began to return, their cries sharp and fragile in the still air. Eleanor stopped to look back one last time. "It's over," she said softly. Thomas followed her gaze. "No," he said. "It's beginning." She turned to him, puzzled, but he was staring at something in his hand, a fragment of the crystal, still faintly glowing, its light no longer wild, but steady, rhythmic. It pulsed in sync with his heartbeat. Eleanor stepped closer, her voice cautious. "You need to let it go!" He looked at her, torn between awe and fear. "Maybe it's not done with us." The wind rose gently, carrying the scent of rain and earth. The sky was clearing, streaks of sunlight breaking through the clouds like the first breath after drowning. Thomas closed his fist around the shard, then slowly opened it again. The light dimmed, fading until only the morning sun remained. They walked for hours without speaking, descending from the plateau as the landscape slowly came alive around them. By the time they reached the valley, the world seemed almost untouched, as if history had folded itself neatly back into silence. But Eleanor knew better. She could feel it, the faint vibration in the air, not malevolent, not powerful, just present. The pulse hadn't died. It had changed. That night, as they camped by the edge of the old riverbed, she couldn't sleep. The stars above were impossibly bright, the kind of sky only seen after a storm has scoured the world clean. Thomas sat a few feet away, staring into the fire, lost in thought. "What happens now?" she asked softly. He didn't look up. "Now we live with what we've woken!" The flames crackled, their light reflecting in his eyes. And for a moment, Eleanor thought she saw the faintest glimmer of that same inner glow. But it was gone before she could be sure. The night deepened, and the wind carried the scent of rain again, faint but familiar. Somewhere, beneath layers of soil and time, something ancient had gone quiet. Not destroyed, just sleeping, waiting for the next hand, the next ambition, the next age of men to stir it again. Eleanor closed her eyes. The image of the vault burned forever into her mind. She thought of Rhodes, not as a villain or a god, but as a man who had looked too deeply into the heart of history and never escaped. When she finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. "Maybe the past doesn't die," she said. "It just changes its name." Thomas said nothing. He simply watched the fire burn lower, the last embers glowing like the faint heartbeat of the earth, slow, steady, eternal. And somewhere far below them, unseen and unheard, one fragment of crystal pulsed once, then went still. Morning came quietly, the kind of morning that feels older than sound. Mist hung over the plain, silver and slow-moving, drifting through the trees like memory refusing to let go. Eleanor stood by the river's edge, her boots sinking into the wet soil. The world looked peaceful, deceptively so. But beneath the calm, she could still feel it. The faint hum of something alive. Not dangerous now, just existing. The air was cooler, softer. For the first time since they'd entered the vault, it didn't feel like history was watching them. It felt like it was resting. Thomas was a few steps behind her, crouched beside the dying campfire, tracing circles in the ash with a small stick. His movements were slow, thoughtful, like someone trying to remember a dream that's already slipping away. The shard, the last remnant of the crystal, lay on a rock between them. In the sunlight, it no longer glowed. It just caught reflections like an ordinary piece of glass. Yet Eleanor couldn't help but sense that it was more than that. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The world had changed overnight, but in ways no one else would ever see. Somewhere beyond the horizon, nations still carried on. The modern world still spinning forward. Cars, machines, cities built on invisible foundations. But here, in the quiet cradle of Africa, where earth and empire had once collided, something deeper had shifted. It was as if the planet itself had exhaled after holding its breath for centuries. Thomas finally broke the silence. "Do you think it's really over?" Eleanor didn't look away from the river. "Maybe it never ends. Maybe it just moves." She paused, listening to the sound of water against stone. History doesn't vanish. It becomes something else. Someone else? He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "You think it'll wake again?" "Someday," she said softly. "When the world starts wanting too much again. When someone believes they can own what can't be owned." The words lingered between them like mist, heavy but true. There was no certainty, only the quiet acceptance that some cycles never truly break, they just change their rhythm. They packed their things as the sun rose higher. The valley stretched out before them, vast and ancient, painted in gold. In the distance, the plateau was barely visible, its shape soft by the light. It looked harmless now, just another ridge among countless others. But Eleanor knew what slept beneath it, and that knowledge settled in her chest like both a wound and a gift. As they walked, the landscape began to shift, fields of tall grass giving way to clusters of trees, the air filling with the calls of unseen birds. It felt like walking through time itself, each step pulling them further from what had been and closer to what might be. They stopped at a small rise overlooking the valley. From there, the world looked infinite. A place reborn, fragile, and untouched. Thomas took the shard from his pocket, turning it over in his hand. "I can't stop thinking," he said quietly, "if this thing was always feeding on belief. Maybe belief isn't the problem. Maybe it's what we choose to believe in." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Maybe power doesn't come from the earth, Thomas. It comes from us! We just keep pretending it's something buried in the ground." He set the shard down on the earth and pressed it gently into the soil until it disappeared beneath the dirt. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, as if in response, a faint tremor rippled through the ground. Not violent, not threatening. It felt almost like acknowledgement. Then it was gone. They walked on. Hours later, when the heat began to rise and the world shimmered with mirages, they reached a small village at the edge of the desert. The people there went about their morning as they always had, unaware of what had stirred just beyond the horizon. Children chased goats through narrow paths. Old women ground maize beneath the shade of baobab trees, and the scent of smoke drifted through the air. Life was as it had always been. Fragile, ordinary, eternal. A man approached them, his face creased from years of sun, his eyes deep and patient. He offered them water, a seat, a moment to rest. Eleanor thanked him, and as they drank, she asked in a quiet voice, "Do you ever feel the ground hum here? Like it's alive?" The man smiled, his teeth bright against weathered skin. "The earth? always hums, he said, but only those who listen hear it. His words settled into the air like truth, disguised as wisdom. Thomas glanced at Eleanor, and for the first time in days, she laughed softly, not out of joy, but relief. The sound felt foreign, but it also felt like release. They stayed until evening, helping where they could, patching a fence, sharing stories, exchanging silence. When the sun began to sink, they set out again, the horizon burning orange and red. The light caught the dust in the air, turning the world golden, and for a fleeting second, Eleanor thought she saw the outline of the old vault rising from the plain again. But when she blinked, it was gone. By nightfall, they had reached the border of a new stretch of wilderness. The stars hung low and clear, their light soft and endless. Thomas lay back on the ground, hands behind his head. "It's strange," he said. "Everything feels the same, but I can't shake the feeling that we changed something." Eleanor looked up at the sky. "Maybe we didn't change the world? Maybe we changed the story it tells about itself." He turned his head toward her. "And what story is that?" "That even the greatest empires," she said, "are still made of people trying to understand what they fear." The words drifted into the night, joining the song of crickets and wind. Somewhere out there, the pulse still lived quieter, more patient, waiting for another age to give it shape again. But maybe, just maybe, it would find a gentler form this time. As the fire burned low, Eleanor thought about Rhodes, not the man from history books, but the haunted echo they'd seen in the vault. She imagined him standing there now, in whatever place history keeps its restless souls, finally watching the world without reaching for it. And in her heart, she wondered if he understood at last that power had never been his to claim. She closed her eyes and listened to the earth, to the fire, to the faint heartbeat of life itself. It was all connected, the rise and fall of empires, the greed and the grace, the endless cycle of creation and forgetting. Maybe that was the truth. The vault had guarded all along that history isn't about who wins or loses, but about what endures after both are gone. In the stillness, a soft wind passed through the grass, carrying with it the sound of something ancient and kind, a whisper that could have been the earth. Or memory, or maybe just imagination. It said nothing clear, only a feeling that endings are never really endings, just pauses between stories. When dawn came again, the sky bloomed with color, violet, gold, and soft gray. Eleanor stood once more at the riverbank, watching light ripple across the water. She dipped her hand in, feeling the cold current rush past her fingers. For a moment, it felt like the pulse again, but gentler now, as if the land had forgiven. She looked back toward Thomas, who was already packing, and smiled. "Do you think anyone will believe us?" He shrugged, a faint grin tugging at his lips. "Probably not. But maybe they'll feel it, even if they don't understand it." They began to walk once more, their footsteps fading into the tall grass. Behind them, the land stretched wide and endless, carrying both the weight of history and the promise of something new. The wind rose and fell, whispering through the plains, like the voice of time itself, steady, unending, patient. And as the horizon swallowed them whole, the world returned to silence. Somewhere far below, unseen and unfelt, the last fragment of the ancient crystal shimmered faintly in the soil, not in warning, not in power, but in peace. Its pulse was no longer the sound of conquest or greed. It was the heartbeat of the earth, slow and eternal. Maybe that was always what it had been. And as the sun climbed higher, painting the land in light, one question hung quietly in the air, one that had no answer, only echoes. If history itself could remember, what would it forgive? And what would it keep?